All right. Hello, everyone. I see the numbers jumping up. We're going to get started in just a second, but we are going to launch a poll if you want to share, how excited you be to be here today. And then if you had to pick one out of these three options, what is top of mind for you? We will get started shortly. This is right on the screen, the webinar for Let's Talk About Privilege, how to acknowledge and navigate your privilege at work. We have a phenomenal panel for you today, and the webinar will be available on our website and on YouTube a week after today. So we will post it there. I see some responses coming in. I'm going to give it until like 30 more seconds. All right. Have 86 folks joining, incredible. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Awesome. So to start off, my name is Christina Giordano, she, her, hers. And I'm a senior partnerships manager here at AllVoices, one of the sponsors of the webinar today. To give some context around AllVoices, we are an employee intelligence platform to really systemically ask for, accept, analyze, and act on really feedback of all kinds. You can find good ideas and bad actors in real time, reducing turnover, recruiting costs, and really improving your company culture. Because we know that when employees and employers feel seen, heard, and understood, we know that the company culture is just better, and it's a win-win situation for everybody. So with that, I will pass to Sarah to talk a little bit about OfficeTogether.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Christina. My name is Sarah. I'm here with OfficeTogether, and OfficeTogether is a workplace collaboration platform built for the hybrid office. We empower teams to bring their people back together in person, flexibly at the office. And today, what our product looks like is desk and room booking, in-person collaboration and team scheduling, COVID vaccine tracking and compliance, and hybrid events management, all from the OfficeTogether platform, Slack or Teams. But as hybrid work continues to evolve, we'll continue to build a platform that puts the employee front and center. From new employee onboarding to schedule and desk management to employee social tooling, we're committed to building an end-to-end hybrid employee platform that facilitates in-person work. And our CEO and founder, Amy, is here today on the panel, and we're excited to be here. And so, Jared, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. I can see why the three of us have partnered OfficeTogether and AllVoices. So I'm Jared, Karol, he, him, calling in from Oakland. I'll do a more thorough intro in just a second, as well as the panelists. I'll be moderating the panel, but I want to talk to you a little bit about Translator, what Translator is. So we're actually doing a little exercise in our platform that'll kind of set the tone and kind of set the foundation for the conversation that we're going to have with our panelists. So Translator is an experience platform for employees and an analytics platform for companies. So super high level, it's about culture change. So the way it works, and we'll get a little kind of mini experience of this, little mini version of this today, is that employees, or in this case, participants in a webinar like this, will interact with anonymous digital modules. We're going to do one today, a mini version of one, to learn, grow, and generate data. So it's about the experience, the social learning, but also, after the fact, once, if your company went through and you had a team, it could be a cohort of 30, it could be a whole company of 500, anywhere in between. You participate in the activity, you generate data through the modules that we see on the back end. And then we measure and improve workplace culture, create reports, benchmark over time. So I'm assuming most of the people on this call are DEI leaders, HR leaders, L&D, learning, leadership development, in some sort of role where you're some, people, culture people, et cetera. So you're the type of people who we work with behind the scenes to set up the sessions that we do with companies, but also to provide data and recommendations moving forward. And that's kind of the last step of the process of the flow is, hey, here's what your people said in the session. Here's the data. You can't unknow it once you know it. Here's what we recommend. And then you take it all and you improve your workplace culture, policy change, systems, content, et cetera. And sometimes we're involved in that. And sometimes, it supplements what you are already doing. So in a moment, so that's super high level. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the panelists. We're going to have a discussion about privilege. But to get us started, I actually want to get you on the platform. And so as a little bit of a framing, you may have heard of this exercise called the Walk of Privilege. It was done a lot of times in high school or college, sometimes even company retreats, they do it. And what would happen is, as you can see on the screen there, everyone would stand in a line. And maybe it's in a gym, in an athletic field, or a big conference room, or something like that. And the facilitator, the moderator, someone like me, would read questions, and they might say, step forward if both of your parents went to college. And so if that applied to you, you'd step forward. If it didn't, you'd kind of stay where you were. And then the facilitator might read another question that says, step backwards if you worry about deportation for anyone in your family. If that applied to you, you'd step backwards, et cetera. So the facilitator read 20, 30, 40 questions, whatever. And over time, you'd have people all across the room, some way out in front of the line where they started, some behind, some kind of the middle. Some maybe didn't feel comfortable, or it was too vulnerable to answer these questions, so they weren't being honest. And so you got kind of this kind of amalgamation of people across the room. But there were a couple of problems with the activity. One, it's an ableist activity, right? So it assumes that everyone can actually stand up and walk. I mean, as you can see in the picture, right? So that we know that's not true. And the other biggest problem is that, well, how do we do it if we're not all in the same space together? So even before COVID, and I know that the folks on this panel, know all about this, like, hybrid workspaces, distributed workforces, companies, with international workforces. How are you going to do this if you're not all in the same room? So because we believed in the power of the activity and what it did, we also wanted to have the social learning component of it, which we're going to kind of get a little taste of today. So I want you, and if you were thinking that we were going to ask you to kind of focus and put your phone away, actually want you to get your phone back out and go to www.join.host and enter that pin 3844. And so we found that Chrome and Safari work best. Also, if you want a bigger screen, like for accessibility purposes, you can more than, it works on the same thing with an extra browser or an extra window on your computer is fine. So I'm going to do a little bit of onboarding. As I said, this is a little taste of what this is, but it's just to get kind of the flavor that'll help inform the discussion that we're about to have with these wonderful panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment. So before we jump in, just a few notes. This is 100% anonymous. You're going to interact in this platform and you're going to get a privileged position. It doesn't really mean a lot because there are only 5 questions, but if it was a full experience, there'd be 35, and it would support a much broader discussion that we would have with your team or with your company. But everything that we collect is 100% anonymous. The whole idea is intended to create more awareness and start a conversation. It's not a definitive marker or anything like that. It's just intended to create more awareness and start that conversation. And it's about growth and reflection. So as you can imagine, we come into companies and you have all kinds of people who have all kinds of familiarity and fluency with the idea of privilege and even kind of diversity, equity, inclusion topics, right? So there's all kinds of nuanced reactions and responses, but we always say, hey, this is about growth, this is about reflection, what does it mean? And we'll share some of that in the panel today. There are no right or wrong answers. You're going to see 5 questions. As soon as I turn the platform on, you'll see there's going to be 5 questions. It's just swipe up, swipe down if it applies to you. There's nothing right or wrong. It's all about your lived experience. And if you want, you can see there at www.join.host, in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a little kind of yellowish orange chat icon. If you want, you can share anything, and it comes as a one-way text to me. Now, in this setting, I might not be able to answer all the questions or respond to all the things that come in because I'm going to be moderating the panel, but just that is something that we use when we do this inside companies for people who want to share, who have questions, who want to maybe challenge something or maybe be vulnerable, but they don't really want their name or their identity attached to it. They comment through the anonymous chat tool, and then I would, as the facilitator, bring that into the conversation. And so that's a little bit about what this is. I'm going to turn on the platform, so you're going to see a little bit of the sausage making here behind the scenes. So your screen should update if you are at www.join.host with the pin 3844. You're going to see a screen. There's going to be a couple prompts to get you on, and then you'll just see there'll be 5 questions. You swipe up if it applies to you, swipe down and read each question carefully. You'll get a privileged position. It doesn't mean a ton. I wouldn't read too much into it, but that'll form the kind of the basis of our discussion. And I invite the panelists to participate as well, because some of the conversation that we'll have will be around this. So I'll stop talking, let you do this. It should, with only 5 questions, should only take you about a minute or so. Yep, and as you can see, we've already got people completing it. So these 5 questions were just a sampling of when we do this with the full experience. We have 35 questions, and they're mostly around socioeconomic, racial, gender, other ideas around privilege and marginalizations. But we just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor today. So as you can see, they're coming in 88 completions. Thank you all for participating. Hopefully that includes the panelists as well. All right, so if you are still working on it, totally fine. This will stay open the whole time, so you can still complete it. But I'm going to go back to, so a few things before I introduce the panelists and we get into our discussion. I just want to share a few things that we at Translator, how we think about privilege, how we talk about privilege. I know, Antonio, you're going to have a definition around, you know, how your company defines privilege. We, by no means do we see ourselves as, you know, the expert or the voice of this, but just a couple notes that we use to frame when we go in and have these discussions with companies. There are many different types of privilege, right? Often we think of, you know, of white privilege as kind of the dominating one, the one that's most talked about, and of course that is a type of privilege. But there's also education privilege, there's beauty privilege, there's wealth privilege, there's all kinds of different types of privilege. Hopefully, some of which we'll talk about today. Privilege can change over time, right? Depending on context, depending on you know, age, depending on where you live, your circumstances, all kinds of things that it can change over time. Privilege can be changed, as I said, based on context, location, etc. And here's something that's really important. Not all privileges or marginalizations are equal. So it's and I hope again that we'll get into some of this when we have our discussion, that each one of us has some sort of privilege or has had some sort of privilege at some point in some context, but that doesn't mean that the privilege or the marginalization that we've experienced or are experiencing are all the same. So it's just something, and again, this is a very nuanced kind of points that I hope will be elaborated on in the discussion. But here's what we always stress, and this goes back to those notes before we did the exercise. Understanding and validating our privileges, our marginalization, is how we actually enter into conversations and start to make small and large acts that change the cultures for better. And we'd like to do just a few kind of equations, if you will. We think of privilege as the opposite of oppression, right? So privilege, like an unearned advantage, competitive advantage that we have based on things often beyond our control, right? The opposite of oppression. And this is something really important. More privilege equals less energy. So you might have 2 people at the same place, but what did it take to get there? And what does it take to maintain that place, right? So that's enough of the framing of this. Thank you all for taking the exercise. I want to introduce myself a little more fully, and then the panelists, and actually jump into this discussion to unpack some of this a bit. So I'm going to actually stop sharing. So my name is Jared Karol, he, him pronouns. I'm the head of product experience here at Translator. I've been doing this work, facilitation, coaching, moderating panels, et cetera, for about 8 years. I also have a background in teaching. I taught a social justice curriculum to middle school students. And I do this work because my father was a gay man and he died of AIDS in 2000, which is when I really dove into doing this work. And that's why I'm here. So that's enough about me. Let's turn over to the panelist. Antonio, I'll start with you. Just introduce yourself, pronouns, your role at the company, and the work you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. My name is Antonio Mannings, pronouns he, him. I'm the head of DEI and internal portfolio here at Amount. The work that I do is structured around evaluating all of Amount's internal processes through a lens of equity. So communications, marketing, legal, all of these things, but especially where we sit in our talent department, making sure we provide a consistent, fair, equitable experience for all of our Amountees, as we call our employees here.
Awesome. I like that, the Amountees. Sounds like a punk band, you know, from the 90s or something. Awesome. Thank you, Antonio. So glad to have you here. Shanika Kennedy, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to be on the panel.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Shanika Kennedy. I currently work for Found Health. So we're a weight loss or weight care company based on personalized and prescription based weight care assistance. And so currently I am the DEI lead and health coach at Found. And so being a very young company, really building the DEI framework from the ground up with a focus on health equity being in this weight care industry.
Awesome. Thank you, Shanika. And just full disclosure, Shanika and Found are clients of Translator. We've just started to work with them, I don't know, a couple months ago, and we're really looking to do a lot of good things together. So thank you, Shanika, for being with us. And last but not least, Amy, welcome.
Thanks for Amy, the CEO of Founder of OfficeTogether. I founded OfficeTogether because the way we show up as fundamentally
Is it? Yeah, I was hearing kind of like a buzz. Are other people hearing that too? Okay, I wasn't going to interrupt because I didn't know if it was just me or not. Amy, you want to try again? Yeah, I think someone in the chat said, I think you're muted.
How about
there we
now?
go. Yeah, there we go.
All right, sorry about that.
That's okay. Take two.
Yes, hi, I'm Amy. I'm the CEO and founder of OfficeTogether. I got really excited about the future of work because the pandemic has totally shifted how we think about offices, collaboration, and in person. And there's a big element of privilege to commuting, showing up in the office every day. And on the converse, flexible work has a big part of our story to how we can help elevate many different people who are traditionally felt like more excluded or that in office cultures were more hostile. So I'm really excited about this topic. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Well, that's a great, I'm glad you went last there because it kind of leads me into my first question, which I'd love to start with you and Shanika. This idea of, why is it important? Why is it important to think about how privilege and class shows up in the workplace now as we think about the future of work, right? That phrase is thrown around a lot. It's been thrown around, far before the pandemic kind of started. Why is it important when we think about increased accessibility to corporate jobs? So Amy, I'd love to hear your take on that, and then Shanika as well.
Totally. We're at this amazing moment in time where we have a unique opportunity to rewrite workplace norms. So studies showed that pre-pandemic, underrepresented minorities felt more hostility or less excitement about being in the office because it was designed for more of a heteronormative experience. However, after 2 years of being remote, studies have also shown by the Harvard Business Review that remote work has exacerbated existing inequities because communities of color have less accessible to remote friendly jobs, and traditionally marginalized employees, they sometimes feel like conditions improved, but it's not enough. And so, with OfficeTogether, we're here to support the middle ground, which is hybrid. So it's about people working on the schedules that work best for them. And for most people, that's not 5 days a week in the office, but it's usually not 0 too. And so I think that like enabling flexible work and working moms and parents to take care of their kids and work not necessarily 9 to 5, that is a big part of how we enable a bigger class of folks to participate in knowledge work and technology and like these cutting edge industries.
Yeah, no, I love it, Amy. You're talking about this intentionality, right? You have to have the awareness and then be intentional about how you communicate, how you set things up, what are the expectations, et cetera. Shanika, I think I know, Found is, am I correct in this, 100%, remote, right? So yeah, tell me a little bit about, kind of from your perspective at Found and just what you're seeing kind of with your clients, with your customers, I also know you're growing pretty rapidly too as a company. So yeah, any insights you have, and we welcome them.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy, for that kind of introduction into this topic. I 100% agree with you. And I think that for Found, being a remote first company, there are those challenges. And I think one of the things that's really unique being in a remote environment is also we're seeing each other's personal lives pretty like in front of us, right? We're in our homes, maybe most of us have probably seen a kid sneak into the video or a spouse or something pass by. And I think that enables a really unique opportunity and a duty to kind of understand how privilege and class kind of relate to the work environment. I'd also say that, we've all experienced several historical events in the last few years. And I think that because of that, we've taken a lot of companies have taken the efforts to make sure that, DEI, for instance, is at the forefront. And that's creating a much more integrated workplace. And I think because of that, we're having, different opinions. We've got to think about things like the wealth gap and educational demands and the people who've lost their jobs and, just different environments and experiences that we've all had. And I think that changes to how we're evaluating employee performance. We have to consider like how are people's environments impacting their ability to show up to work and the way that they show up to work? And how are we meeting employees where they are because they're showing up to work kind of in these environments now? And I think on top of that, we're seeing that consumers care about these things. Consumers want to know like what are the companies doing to consumers and job seekers, I'd say, to create, environments where, privilege and class is acknowledged, but there's also the opportunity for education and to create a space that's inclusive. And so I think that kind of all of these things, it's a very loaded question. There's lots of little pieces to think about there. But I think all of those things kind of tie into what we're seeing the workplace become in the last.
Yeah. No, I love it. And just, having gotten to know you a little bit personally, but also your company, I think what you just said, a lot of what you said, I'm already seeing just in kind of the conversations with you and your colleagues at Found. Antonio, I see your hand, which is great because I was going to segue to you next. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that question, but also, how have you seen privilege manifesting at work? Like, what does that look like? I mean, yeah, okay, so we just talked about it. We did the little kind of example in the platform, but what does it look like when how does it manifest? What does it look like on a day-to-day, example or illustration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, but before I get into that, I want to really
go
into the first question. Thinking about the return to work, the future of work. I'm calling in today from our offices in downtown Chicago. And if you've ever been to Chicago, you might know that it can take an hour to get anywhere within the city. So when you take that hour of commute away in the morning, you take that hour away in the evening, most of the folks who are at home are still producing. They're at their desk early, they're at their desk late as well. That return to office, however, when we think about privilege and equity, for some folks, now they're looking at, okay, I'm spending 2 hours a day in traffic. I'm spending X amount of dollars on gas. And we know that the prices have gone up recently. So I'm not tied to a specific opinion or position on that, but I think these are things that we absolutely have to consider as we move forward in the future of work. What does it look like? Do we have everything that we need to be successful? Where we were in the office before, and there may have been a telecommuting stipend or telephone payment for you monthly. Has that been adjusted since folks are working at home, now that they're using their own internet and their own electricity? So again, the question of equity. To get into the question, how have we seen it manifest at work? So I think it's really easy to talk about the obvious privileges like white privilege or identifying as male or hetero. But it's a bit different when you look at things like being differently able or neurodiverse. So when I have a conversation with someone and it comes up that I'm a disabled veteran, the first thing that happens is they look down and check for all of my limbs. Those things are still there, but not all injuries can be seen. So where my PTSD and my anxiety and those things may be, they're not necessarily addressed in the work environment. Folks don't talk about it because they don't know it. And I know myself and some other folks are a bit guarded around those sorts of things. But even if we look back just to the beginning of this call today, and we did the short walk of privilege virtually on our phones or our desktops, laptops, some of us read faster than others. So as I'm getting through those questions a bit slower because of the dyslexia, and we have to talk about that as well. But unless we talk about it and become uncomfortable in that conversation and get through it, we'll never get to the end of it. And I just want to make sure that I put a fine point on that. It's really about having the conversations, figuring out what the needs of the groups are before we try to address them.
Wow, Antonio, so many good things you brought up. And you know, and Shanika knows this because she's participated in the fuller experience. The full title of the workshop where we do this walk of privilege is called Self-Awareness and Empathy. And it speaks to so much of what you just touched on, Antonio, around, you know, we all have our own lived experiences, and we might be familiar with some other things or some other kind of elements of someone else's life, but until we're actually in a space and we're sharing stories and we're being vulnerable, we don't always have even the awareness that someone else's experience is different than ours. And so when we are made aware, then the question is like, well, what do we do about that? Do we dismiss it? Do we downplay it? Do we, all the things, right? And so there are privileges in that, and to kind of be unaware. So yeah, super interesting, Antonio. I think you brought up this idea of equity, and I'd love to kind of shift back to Amy. You know, how do you see hybrid, a hybrid work environment being intentionally inclusive and equitable and accessible, right? This idea, like, what are some of the things that you're seeing, maybe at your company, but also kind of in the space that where people are doing it well or trying to do it well, and maybe where they're having some things that they're missing?
Yeah, I think that we're still at very early stages of hybrid. Some of the problems that we address with hybrid is that, Antonio might commute to the office and no one else is there. And so he's already frustrated by the commute, and then he's triply frustrated that he commuted and no one is there. The number one reason that stops people from going to the office is the commute. And commute is often tied to privilege, right? Oftentimes offices are located in more central parts of town. And then, there's a correlation between income and how close to the center of town that you can live in. And so that's a little bit tricky, because I think commute is one of the hardest things to fix about hybrid work, or what the number one barrier to getting people into the office. So that I think there's a few things that people can do to make it more intentional. What we've seen, what many of our clients do, is they'll pick one day a week that's the big office day, like Tuesday or Thursday, or make that for the team. And so you're remote 4 days of the week, and then you're in the office that one day. And then the number one reason that people are going to that office for that one day is for social connection and collaboration. It's not about being productive. It's not about working. It's about building that trust and creating that fabric. And there's a real business case for people to do that, right? So companies that foster relationships and friendships at work are 12% more profitable. And if you have a BFF at work, you're 700% more engaged. And so, you're commuting that 2 hours once a week to go hang out with your BFF. And when you put it that way, it doesn't seem so crazy, because we spend more time commuting for our social lives already on that place. And so the big flip that we're seeing with our best clients is that they're thinking of the office as a watering hole or a place for folks to come together for connection rather than a place for people to get work done. Because we all know that we can be hyper productive at home, even if our kids are banging down the door. The second thing I'll say is that hybrid work for a lot of parents has been like a huge hallelujah, because now they don't have to work 9 to 5 and they're able to pick up their kids in the morning or drop them off in the afternoon. And so part of hybrid is also about flexible work hours. And so I think that companies who index less on like your butts and seats 9 to 5 or you're online from 9 to 5 are also really benefiting from this flexible work boom.
Awesome, Amy. I was laughing a little bit when you said the BFF. I have 7th grade twins. They just, actually just finished 7th grade yesterday, and the biggest word I hear in their lexicon is bestie. Oh, yeah, even calling me, oh, you're my bestie. It's like, you know, I know you want something, but I'm not really your bestie. But so it's kind of funny, but it's true, right? Like, I'm an extrovert. I'm a social person. I kind of miss, you know, going in and see, but at the same time, I'm not, you know, I get it. Like, there are things that are you know, that we have to think about, that it's not just as easy as you pointed out, right? And I love how you bring in studies and research and stuff, because it's one thing to be like, yeah, this is how we're feeling, which is important, right? This is kind of how we're feeling, but also, and here's the research that kind of supports that, right? So it's really powerful. Thank you. Antonio, and you kind of did this, but I'd love just to hear a little bit more. Any specific examples of how inclusive language and privilege, or inclusive language, either does or does not kind of enter into conversations? You kind of gave the example around, you know, disabilities, invisible disabilities, right? And also this idea, you know, and I know I've been guilty of this over the years, and I'm trying to be more mindful of it, around this concept of like, you know, bring your whole self to work, right? Or be your authentic self. Okay, great, if the environment is one where I feel like I can actually do that, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit on that, this idea of inclusive language and privilege, and how it works or doesn't work to create the type of, you know, workplace culture that we say we all want.
Sure. So I'll start by saying that 20 years ago, I cut my locks for a job. I'll come back to that in just a second. The part that's important about that to me is that the language we use in the offices, not just my office here, but in our offices, are generally gender exclusive, or they can be race exclusive, or physically exclusive, or neuro exclusive. And I'll give you some examples, and myself included. I use the term guys. I mean it gender neutrally, but it's not inclusive for everyone. So if someone walks into the room and they say, all right, guys, we had a gentleman's agreement that in layman's terms, everyone would be grandfathered in. Right?
Wait, grandfathered into what? Sorry.
So I'm just giving an example of some of the terms that we see in the offices. So, okay, guys, we had a gentleman's agreement that in layman's terms, everyone would be grandfathered in. So when I mentioned those things because when I came into this role as head of DEI, I wanted to make sure that we Mounties are using the same language to identify groups of people, communities of people, and the attributes of those groups and communities. So building out our first diversity vocabulary, including pride language. So when we say something like grandfathered is problematic, well, what's a replacement for it? Maybe using included or legacied. Instead of saying a gentleman's agreement, how about a handshake agreement? And I did that this morning, as a matter of fact, unintentionally, but it landed right in my lap. So even if we are aware of these things, sometimes our training, our experiences, they'll come back on us. I think that it's also important that when we think about things like the exclusive language around race, is something blacklisted or black bagged. Who's ever heard the term a brown bag session referring to a lunch and learn? Also problematic language. So being able to identify what those problematic items are and then providing an answer for it, a supplement for it, removing it completely from the organizational language is important.
Antonio, what's problematic about brown bag lunch?
So brown bag comes from the historical brown bag test, where you couldn't get into a place if you were darker than the color of a brown paper bag.
Oh, I
Yeah.
thought it was the thing that you carried your lunch in.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You can carry your lunch in it. But a brown bag session, using that term is problematic, just like grandfather being problematic.
Yeah.
Or having a master-slave relationship or a master bathroom, those sorts of things. There's so much in the way we use our language, and anyone who knows me will tell you that I believe words matter. And when we know that these words matter, we have to choose better words to express our feelings.
Yeah, Antonio, I loved you. And I typed it in the chat just so everyone could hear it. I loved your example. I was kind of laughing just because there were so many, just in that one sentence you used, I think there were 4 problematic things. And I know, Translator, the one of the reasons why Translator is called Translator is because our founder, Natalie Egan, is a trans woman. And she was a self-described tech bro, before her transition. I think it was 2016, about 6 years ago. And so she said, and she kind of had a very similar company that she runs now, very successful, right? So this kind of DEI tech company. And she said, her path to understanding, privilege and equity and all these things were with her, transition, because she had never experienced, so many things that she now experiences as a trans woman. So one thing that she gets triggered by is the word guys, right? I have boy girl twins, right? As I mentioned, hey guys, time to get to school, guys, go to bed, guys, right? I've tried to really stop doing that. They don't care. Neither one of them has said anything, but I'm trying to be mindful of that in all my language. So I loved your example because it's so common. And this kind of segues into kind of the next question that I wanted to kind of bring Shanika in, and Amy, and you, Antonio, as well. But how do we authentically engage in conversations around one's privilege? So it's a privilege to decide that I'm not going to consider your concerns, right? Oh, Antonio, you're being too sensitive, right? Or is that really a big deal? Right? So how do we actually engage in these conversations, especially if these are new concepts to us, if there are things? So Shanika, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then, I'll turn it over to Amy as well.
Yeah, I think thought a little bit about this question. And I think one of the things is instilled in the workplace culture, right? Like I think in order to have these conversations, they're typically very difficult. We have our personal stake in that conversation, whether it's we feel like we don't have any privilege, we feel like we have a ton of privilege, we have personal relationships that kind of impact our perception of that privilege. And so I think it's really important, one, that when you're wanting to have these conversations in the workplace, that there's a foundation of like a little bit of trust there that's been established. And, something that it was really powerful for our collaboration with Translator was, I think that Found has done a really great job at establishing that trust at the beginning, to where when we got into a partnership with Translator, where we were able to have that discussion, there was already this kind of energy of transparency. And I think that that's done in personal relationships in the workplace. It's done with your management team. It's done by, your C-level executives, being really integrated into your daily work environment. And I plugged Translator in there because I think that that is one of those ways to kind of open that door to having those authentic discussions about privilege. And I think, a huge piece of that is just it being genuine. So outside of that, outside of having these facilitated workshops where you're able to, engage in an activity together, open the door to actually talking about, where did you land on that scale? How did that make you feel? I think that allows more space to kind of have those discussions and chat with one another and, share lived experiences and therefore reflect on your own. But I do think that a huge piece of that is, one, a little bit of education beforehand, before going into those environments, self-assessment and self-reflection, and creating this space, at the workplace. One of the things that Found does really well, we have a Wellness Wednesday. And on that day, sometimes we host a Foundcast, which allows us to speak about our experiences. So we have some of the leaders in the tech area. We have some of the leaders who are women, or we have practice to industry, and talk about your story. And I think that that opens a door for others to feel comfortable in actually sharing their own stories and having those discussions about privilege.
Yeah, I love it. And Amy, I want to get your thoughts too, but I just want to say a couple things. A couple people did use the anonymous chat, so I want to bring these into the conversation. And this idea, one thing we say when we talk about privilege is it's a neutral thing. So often folks who have a lot of privilege, like me, right? White folks, straight folks, cis folks, right? People who are part of a dominant or, kind of a mainstream narrative. Often when we hear the word privilege, we hear it as an accusation, and it's not. It is. There is privilege. Some people have it, some people don't. And then conversely, with marginalizations, I think once people understand, like, oh, what does marginalized mean? Oh, it means you're not kind of seen as, Antonio, your example, right, of, feeling you had to cut your locks for a job. Whether, I don't know if you just kind of felt you had to, or if someone actually told you to, but either way, right? And so then people, oh, well, yeah, so this happened to me, and it's something that's totally minor. That's not, it's like, okay, that's kind of, they're not really the same. So having this discussion in a way that can remove a little bit of the charge from it is both important and really challenging. So Amy, I want to get your thoughts, but before, I just want to bring this into the session. So one person said, why the name Translator? So I answered that, right? Because Natalie, our founder, was a trans woman, but also translating difficult, topics into conversations, as Shanika just kind of talked about. And of course, the data piece too. So kind of multi-layered, why it's called Translator. Another person says, I am biracial, but white passing, and have to self-identify as BIPOC to be taken seriously as a person of color when participating in these discussions, DEIB discussions. What advice does the panel have for me to be accepted for the whole person I am, not what people see on the outside? Wow, really deep. So that actually kind of gets into the next question I wanted to ask. But Amy, I did want to come back to you and get your thoughts. You can answer that question, but also around this idea of authentically and around privilege.
Of course. Well, one of the things I wanted to say is that I'm really impressed that so many companies are taking this super seriously. Like, I had started the Coinbase, first ERG, and it was way newer back in that time. And so, my company, we're a dozen people, a little over a dozen people. We don't have the same number of resources that a bigger company have. I love seeing that, Chloe, you had posted dash lanes, inclusive language training. The company at our stage doesn't have the resources to do that, but there are things that we can do to prove DE&I that don't cost any money. So I wanted to share some of the things that we do. So one of the things is that we talk about the topic. I share my experiences being a woman as a software engineer in the Bay Area, feeling underrepresented, being an immigrant. I talk about things at company all hands, and I make myself vulnerable to the team. They know that diversity is really important to me. Number two is we talk about it regularly in hiring, making sure that we are not exactly the Rooney Rule, but that we are sourcing for underrepresented folks and making that a priority, because it only gets harder as the company gets bigger. And then number three, the question you had said, Jared, which is someone had said does that really matter? What I find is that dismissing people on any topic is generally just not helpful behavior, and it's particularly unhelpful with DE&I. And so oftentimes as a founder, I need to pick my battles. I can't always address every single thing. I can't bring in an expensive DE&I coordinator yet. And so, I think that the best thing that we could do is we can listen and paraphrase and use the phrase, what I heard you saying is. And I find that covers 80-90% of the bases. And so I just wanted to say that some of the techniques here don't always scale for every stage of company, but we still have been able to make DE&I a really core part of our company with basically $0 to spend.
Yeah. Amy, I love so much what you said, especially that last bit around scale, because there's a difference between behavior change and culture change. So behavior change is often individual, right? So we say, like when we do the sessions, and Shanika, you can probably speak to this, right? At the end of a 90-minute session, people, we can already sometimes, if people are very participatory, we'll see like there's behavior change already from minute 1 to minute 90, and then immediately after, like, right? But then culture change is, how do all the individuals in a team, in a company, you know, whatever the kind of cohort is, how do they be more intentional about their behavior change to change the culture, right? So it is harder to scale, but it kind of takes all of us. But I wanted to just I think the person that entered this question in the chat is really great. And it kind of segues with the question that I had on my list, which is around this topic we talked a little bit about kind of earlier, this idea of bringing your whole self to work. So do you think it's idealistic, you know, to believe that you can bring your whole self to work? Why or why not? And I just want to kind of repeat this person, because I think it kind of gets right into this question. I'm biracial, but white passing, and have to self-identify as BIPOC. In other words, hey, I'm BIPOC, right? Look at me. Like, I have to make sure people know to be taken seriously as a person of color when participating in these discussions. So what advice do any of you have? I'll start with you, Antonio, and then, you know, Amy and Shanika, I welcome your thoughts as well. Just around that dynamic that this person's bringing up.
Yeah, so I'll start with my experience first, and then I'll give my advice. So I mentioned 20 some odd years ago, I cut my hair for a job, cut my locks specifically. But to answer the question, do I think it's idealistic? No, I don't. Today, I don't feel that I would have the need to cut my hair to be considered for the job. To be considered 20 some years ago, that was definitely on the table. But with so many organizations, large, small, everywhere in between, moving on their DEI efforts, including the military relaxing its stance on what we refer to as battle-ready hairstyles, not just changing or amending the policy, but building it out to allow for braids and locks and these other things. So if the military can do that, so can other organizations. I wanted to kind of echo something that Amy said. Amy said that they talk about it, which is the first step. And then she said, talking about the sourcing, now they're doing something about it as well. Here's my advice. If you feel that you have to announce your presence in the room, continue to announce your presence in the room. Most of my career, I've been the only in the room. So I don't necessarily have to announce it. If I were, as far as my appearance, but I do have to announce my neurodiversity. Otherwise, folks won't know. I'll bow out of an activity because I'm uncomfortable with that activity, or I'll decline an invitation to an event because I'm uncomfortable with that event. But if we don't tell people, they won't know. So biggest advice is continue to talk about it. But in addition to talking about it, start documenting. As you write out where you are and where you hope to be, that gap in between, how you feel, that becomes your strategy. And you can build on that strategy over time. Moving into this role, one of the first things I did first 30, 45 days is I got heads down into our own gap analysis. That gap analysis produced a 5-year, 3-tier strategic plan with dozens and dozens and dozens of recommendations that we're starting to implement now. Some of them are lightweight, easy to handle, and we can start on them right now. We can move quickly for organizational transformation. Some of them are bigger and they'll require more resources and more time. So we'll push those back, but they're still prioritized. And that's the beauty of documenting, writing these things down. You can go back to it, assess the plan, and then address the plan if you need to change course along the way.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. So many good points. And Shanika, I want to get your thoughts too. And I'm wondering if there's a comment that just came in the Zoom chat from Latasha. She says, can you talk a bit about code switching? Because I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. Not kind of, it is, right? I mean, we're framing it in this idea of bringing your whole self to work. The person in the anonymous chat, around, this idea of white passing, and having, as you said, Antonio, having to declare certain parts of us, right, to be taken seriously. It's all kind of in this realm of code switching. So, Latasha says, can you talk about code switching? For some, it seems that it's a bad thing. For others, how they present or how they are able to meet people where they're at is a product of their own life experience or exposure, a good thing, right? So I'd love, any thoughts on that, Shanika, starting with you, if you want to kind of work that into your answer, that'd be awesome as well.
Yeah, I think, generally the topic of, being able to bring your full or authentic self to work is one that, it can be convoluted in the sense that I do think that sometimes there's an employer responsibility, right, to define what that actually means. And I think that also ties into both of these kind of comments of, in both instances, there can be this element of like not being able to bring your full self to work. And so what does the employer, what is the vision from the employer of that? Because authentic self, for myself, and even on the basis of code switching, is something that it has been something that I feel like I've had to embody my entire life. But in this comment, I do see that as a good thing, right? I do see that as, okay, this is my way of navigating my own personal environments and my own like professional environments, workplace, friends. I think that we all kind of have these different versions of ourselves that we bring into different spaces, whether that's you're having dinner with grandma versus like you're out with your college friends. I think that there's, a time and place for kind of all of these things, but I do think that it is an employer's responsibility. And I think a lot of employers use this kind of like, bring your best self, bring your full self, bring your authentic self. And it's like, what exactly does that mean? And am I going to be, is that going to only be allowed within the constraints of, classist or privileged ideals? Like, is that going to be allowed broadly? Or when I come to work and I am, not code switching, is that going to be accepted? And I think it is largely on the employer's responsibility to kind of create those spaces and then create those safe spaces where, if that's a ERGs that are, for XYZ communities, to be able to go into those spaces, be themselves, be their authentic self, not have to raise their hand and say, hey, this is who I am, but more like I'm a part of this group and I'm being able to collaborate with those who identify similar to me or are allies in this mission. And then we present that and we're able to go back to executive leaders and kind of forge that change. So I think that there's definitely multiple layers of that. But I think ultimately our goal is, you don't want to go to work and feel exhausted because you've put on a facade all day and now you're just burnt out. And so I think that can, be mitigated in different ways. But I think a huge part of that is kind of defining what that looks like and then creating those spaces and no one being kind of having repercussions basically for embodying that claim.
Totally. So many good things, Shanika. And I just want to, Marcel, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, bring your whole self to work doesn't work in all company cultures. People need to gauge what the company culture is first to decide, is it safe? And you all have kind of talked about that. And that last bit you spoke on, Shanika, goes back to that last point on the slide I was sharing, right? More privilege equals less energy. So if I don't have to think about all this stuff and okay, maybe I'm tired at the end of my day, I worked hard, I did all the things, but then what did I not have to do that someone else had to do, had to think about, had to consider, had to navigate, had to worry about, right? All these things. And then Tish brings in just a comment, and there are a couple Q&As. I don't know if we'll have time to get to them. If panelists do have a quick answer and you want to answer them just typing, please do, that'd be great. And thank you, Marcel, I'm glad I got it correct. Tish says, I'm over 50 and just last year brought photos of my children into my office after starting a new job where I felt comfortable openly sharing that part of me. Wow. Right. So it's, I think the work that you all are doing, Antonio, Shanika, Amy, in your positions as, DEI people, or in your case, Amy, the CEO, right? Creating these cultures, having these conversations, making it as clear as you can that it is okay. Not only okay, we want you to bring all of you. Let's talk about it. Let's celebrate. Right. And, it takes time because I have a friend, she has an African sounding name, and she told me this story years ago. She was applying for jobs and she just wasn't getting anything. And then she said, you know what? I'm going to put my middle name, which is Nicole. Boom. All of a sudden she's getting interviews. Imagine that. So, I mean, all these things, how do we create cultures that don't have that? So I want to one final question because we have about 5 minutes. What is your call to action? So you've all kind of snuck it in there a little bit, I think, just in the answers to some of these other questions. But what is your call to action for employees and leaders, and I would say especially leaders, to acknowledge as well as navigate their privilege at work? So we have about 5 minutes. Maybe if you take like a minute each. Antonio, we'll start with you. If you can condense that into a minute, that'd be awesome.
I'm going to boil it down. My recommendation: document. Figure out where you are to start, figure out where you want to go, and then document that stuff in between. That's your strategy. In addition to that, Shanika mentioned the employer responsibility. The onus of responsibility is on the employer. I would say start with your policy, your handbook. Are your policies privileged? Are you restricting the access of your employees? If I can't wear my earrings to work because it's in your policy, now I have to code switch. I'm not bringing my entire authentic self to work. So those are my primary things. There was one other question about LGBTQ folks, that exhaustion. I'll tell you, Black folks feel the same exhaustion from having to teach all of the Black History Month stuff each year, as well as the Juneteenth stuff that's coming up. And I feel your pain, that emotional exhaustion, because you're going to be doing the same thing since it's Pride Month. So here's my recommendation. As you tell folks, as you have to continue to come out to them, maybe move towards documenting and write into a recommendation for the policy, then maybe you add pronouns or preferred pronouns to your IDs or your badges or your key cards. That's one simple step so you don't have to continue.
Awesome. Love it. Love it. And before Shanika and Amy, I want to hear your thoughts, but I just want to, this is really powerful. And this is an example of the power of this anonymous chat. This person said, I asked the question about being white passing. And I want to thank the panel members because their strategies have brought me to tears. I feel so heard, validated, and supported. So that's what this is all about. So thank you for being vulnerable, whoever sent this in, even anonymously, super vulnerable. And thank you to the three of you for sharing your strategies. This is how we connect. So Shanika, yeah, your call to action.
Yeah, I will say that this DEI infrastructure at Found started from 4 voices. 4 of my peers, we started meeting on Fridays to do lunch and learns and talk about challenges that we saw at the workplace. And we took that and we used that fuel and came up with a plan, and we're like, hey, this is what we need you to hear to our executive team. And so one of the things that I think is standing out in all of these discussions, even when we think about LGBT or we think about different passings, it's trying to rally the troops, find your allies, and use your voice. I think that if you can find that DEI leader at your company or whomever is going to listen, and I think the saying of you might knock on a door and not get an answer, but just keep knocking. Going to the people that are going to be able to make these changes, and I think that starts with yourself as well. And so if you're feeling like, hey, this is not the environment that I want to work in, hey, I don't feel like I have a safe space. I don't feel like I have a voice. Finding those allies and finding those people that you can connect with to kind of bring that forth, right? To bring, if it's, hey, we've got a heteronormative environment. Let's change that. Let's find something that we can do, something that we can harness onto that's going to help facilitate that change. For leaders, I think one of the biggest things, it's easy to get get disjointed, right, from the rest of the organization. And so I think having as many opportunities to speak with employees, to speak with your peers is so important. So listening circles, having office hours, that's something that our CEO does really well, is there's office hour opportunity to go to your leadership team and say, hey, this is what we're experiencing. And we got to talk about this. And I think through those conversations, the topic of privilege will naturally kind of arise. And from that, you can kind of self-reflect and educate yourself and move forward and come up with a plan from there.
Awesome. Love it. Amy, last word. Thank you for your patience.
No, totally.
What's your call to action?
Look, 86% of companies are choosing hybrid, and hybrid is a way to support intentional work culture, support working parents, and diverse preferences for how we want to collaborate. And so my call to action is to get organized about it. I see a lot of companies like having folks figure out on their own when to come into the office. They miss each other, and they're not being intentional about their limited time in person together. And so getting organized and getting really intentional about that, about work schedules is something that I think is critical for this next phase of making sure offices turn into these vibrant water coolers instead of what they, for a lot of companies, they feel a little dead these days.
Yeah.
So that is call to action. And, you know, folks can reach out to me, amy@officetogether.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I know we're a minute over time. Thank you, Antonio and Shanika and Amy, for your just powerful insights and shares. Thank you, Christina, for gathering us together. I'll leave one thing too, that and I say this as a cis, straight, white, able-bodied, et cetera, man with a lot of privilege. Believe people. When someone tells you their experience, believe them. That's my call to action for everyone. I just want to bring one last thought into the conversation. This is amazing information. I just wish my leadership team was consistent with culture and tone. Sometimes things are okay and sometimes they are not. I think what the three of you kind of spoke to kind of infiltrates that comment. So Christina, I want to turn it over to you just for any last closing thoughts, but thank you all for being in community together today. This was great.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Shanika and Amy. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Yeah.